Who are the Knights of Africa? In the Western world, the popular understanding of the medieval era is limited and caricatured. It casts its light on Europe with but a few flickering illuminations of the surrounding regions. This is the era of peasant archers, noble knights, Viking raiders, crusaders, Saracens, and Mongols. What lies beyond is a veil seldom explored by media and education. Today, we shall seek to expand our understanding by crossing the Sahara into the realm of medieval West Africa. It is here that knights in great quilted coats and shining armor clashed in the forging of empires. Among the most fearsome of these would be the Mandinka people, who conquered a region as large as the Holy Roman Empire. This was the Great Mali Empire, whose most famous emperor, Mansa Musa, is remembered as the world's richest man. Yet, what goes unreported is the excellence of the Imperial Mali army and its legendary cavalry. In this series, we shall cover their fascinating origins, equipment, training, tactics, and service history. This is the story of the Golden Knights of the Mali Empire.
So I hope you're just as excited to watch this video as we have been to produce it. Let me tell you, as a channel that's focused almost exclusively on Roman history, antiquity, the Mediterranean basin, for European history, stepping outside of those confines to explore more of what's beyond has been a breath of fresh air. I've loved it as a researcher. The production team has loved it for the intricate amount of art and new styles, and it's just been phenomenal. So I really hope you enjoy this. But all this couldn't have been possible without the support of today's researcher and sponsor, Bela. He's an author who not only helped write the script for today's episode, but is also publishing his own trilogy set in medieval West Africa. Book 1, Griots Tell No Lies, follows the story of a cavalry warlord from the Mossi Kingdoms in what is now known as Burkina Faso, who sets out to challenge the Mali Empire. It's been described as an African odyssey where complex characters embark in compelling adventures to not only provide an interesting story, but to also dispel myths and misconceptions about the history of Africa. This historical drama offers an enthralling and accurate depiction of medieval West Africa, and it's available for purchase on Amazon. So if you want to learn more about this fascinating era or just delve into a great piece of historical fiction, check it out in the description below and make sure to leave a like, a review, and a comment. Enjoy.
Before we meet the Knights of Mali, let us first get acquainted with the land from which they came. We can begin with the climate and geography of West Africa. Bounded by the Atlantic Ocean and the Sahara, it is a vast region of comparable size to the western half of Europe. Within lies a rich ecological landscape with distinct zones. At a macro level, these are driven by the desert, whose trade winds bring a dry season in the winter months, while the ocean brings seasonal monsoons. Their effects are not uniform, instead resulting in a gradation of climates with many local biomes. Generally speaking, the northern Sahel region features hot semi-desert and steppe conditions. In the center run the Sudanian savannas, followed by the Guinean forest savanna, and finally the tropical rainforest coasts to the far south. Beyond this, rivers provide further texture to the landscape while carving out channels to connect and divide the aforementioned geographic bands. In this respect, the Niger is the most important. Extending over 4,000 kilometers, it sweeps across West Africa in a wide, arcing, fertile crescent. Along it can be found many life-giving river valleys, tributaries, lakes, and deltas. Of smaller stature but still great importance are the Senegal, Gambia, and Volta rivers. Lastly, we should mention some of the major resources of the area. This included many plant and animal-derived products from the various coastal, forest, and savanna regions. There was also great mineral wealth in the form of copper, silver, and most notably gold, which existed in vast shallow deposits. As should be imagined, this rich geography fostered an equally rich mix of cultures. Unfortunately, a thorough examination of this subject, though well-deserved, is beyond the scope of our episode. Generally speaking, though, we can state that many local powers rose to prominence over the years by controlling and leveraging the region's important resources in furtherance of their own goals. Of particular importance was the acquisition of gold and the monopolizing of trans-Saharan trade. Among the first to achieve this objective were the Soninke people, who capitalized upon the transformative introduction of camels to the region in the 3rd century AD. From the ensuing 4th to 11th centuries, they would forge the vast empire of Ghana. It left a lasting legacy of prosperity, urban development, and an adoption of Islamic traditions which had begun to filter south across the desert. Of most relevance to our story today would be the resultant blending of horsemanship cultures. Native riding had already existed for centuries in West Africa. Here, the various nomadic and pastoral peoples of the plains and plateaus had tamed local horses in accordance with their ways of life. Such breeds were smaller in stature, typically being ridden without a saddle and with a bitless form of bridle. From the Islamic realms now came larger breeds, saddles, stirrups, and new horse armor. Thanks to this influence, horse ownership and equestrian skill increasingly came to serve as tokens of wealth and status, in addition to having practical applications for travel, trade, and warfare. One of the groups which fatefully embraced the horse to their advantage would be the Mandinka, a people who would emerge from the shadows of the Ghana Empire to eventually eclipse them in the forging of the Great Mali Empire. We shall now focus on their story. The Mandinka were an ethnic subgroup of the broader Mande peoples, who had made their home in the southwestern lands of today's Mali and Guinea. It was reportedly rich in forest and wild game, which gave rise to several prominent tribal groups and eventually city-states. Much of this early history has been lost to us, but it seems that during the peak of the Ghana Empire, around the 10th century AD, this region may have fallen under its sway or even become a governed province, with a power center located around the city of Kabul. However, in the late 11th century, Ghana's grip would loosen. Facing internal weakness due to drought and overgrazing, the empire proved less able to maintain control of its key regions and resources. In this self-reinforcing down spiral, control of Saharan trade was seized by the northern Almoravids, while the various territories of the empire now splintered apart. The final death blow was struck around the end of the 12th century, when former subjects, the Soso people, rose up in revolt to conquer the capital of Kumbi Saleh. In the aftermath, this successor group would continue its expansionary campaigns, which claimed 9 kingdoms of the former Ghana Empire. These wars eventually put them on a collision course with the Mande people, who had reformed as a loose federation of clans. While a Mansa, or King of Kings, was technically elected to lead them, his power and the unity of the realm was quite weak at the time. This allowed the Soso to begin picking off the Mandinka chiefdoms one by one. Oral history from this period recalls the harsh rule of a Soso king by the name of Sumanguru Kante. He beheaded rivals, persecuted subjects, and threatened to conquer the entire region in bloody war. Against him would now rise Sundiata Keita, an exiled Mandinka prince who rallied an alliance of smaller kingdoms to fight against the Soso. At the head of this force would ride the assembled might of the Southern Realm's heavy cavalry. Their charge would prove to be the decisive moment in the formation of the Mali Empire and its vaunted knights. But before we continue with this story, let us now take a closer look at these Mandinka cavalry. The horses would have either been the smaller African breeds, such as the local Sahil ponies, Barbs, and Dongolas, or the larger, imported variants such as the Arab horse. In either case, male stallions were typically used for warfare, though female mares were said to have been favoured on night raids owing to their quieter nature when around other horses. Such females were reportedly kept in rural areas for free grazing and breeding, while their male counterparts were stabled. Here they would be fed grass and cereals by a logistics staff, while being taken care of by a team of specialists. The scale of such operations were quite large. The ancient kings of Ghana, for instance, reportedly had 3 attendants for each of their 1,000 horses, in addition to many more equestrian labourers, trainers, and managers. Clearly, horses were prized assets. As such, they would be well protected in battle. This could take various forms, ranging from a partial chest guard to a full covering of the head, neck, body, hindquarters, and legs. The degree of coverage and material used would be a reflection of the owner's wealth. That being said, a standard defensive outfit seems to have relied on the lafidi, a type of quilted vest stuffed with cotton-like kapok fibers. Records and recreations highlight their intricate colors and patterns. Chanfrons and more extensive coats of leather appear to have been slightly more expensive, while chainmail variants were top-of-the-line gear. Some cases of metal plate armor are even recorded, but these were apparently exceedingly rare. Horseshoes, we should mention, were notably absent. In terms of saddles, early riders may have gone without them. However, during the Islamic era, the West African peoples adopted a high-peaked version similar to their northern counterparts. It was made of leather-covered wood with padded cushions. This was placed atop additional cloth layers on the horse's back and affixed with girth and chest straps. Stirrups then hung to either side by leather straps, while reins, often garlanded with dyed fibre triangles, led to the headstall, which was adorned with additional decorative elements. These augmented the prestige and intimidation factor of these war horses. The end result was a stunningly beautiful showcase of West African craftsmanship. As for the cavalrymen themselves, service was restricted to the wealthy and their dependents. This was as much for social reasons as it was for purely economic ones. After all, maintaining a horse and its kit was prohibitively expensive for most. However, those who could afford it would also have been in a position to equally well equip themselves. For defense, this meant wearing quilted cotton or leather gambesons, covering their entire body. These provided robust defense against slashes and arrows in a lightweight package which was easily repaired and, most importantly, breathable in the suffocating weather conditions. That being said, it was also common for affluent nobles to use chainmail shirts. Additionally, iron helmets topped with plumes or hair were quite common. Shields may have even been used sporadically. For offense, soldiers carried a variety of ranged and close-quarters weapons. With regards to the former, the Mandinka famously employed the bow and arrow while on foot. This tradition was carried over by some mounted troops. Indeed, it was Ibn Battuta who described nobles of the Malian court as riding with a bow in one hand and quivers of arrows on their back. However, it does not appear that this practice resulted in a horse archer-dominated force, as might be found among the Mongols or Sassanids. Rather, javelins were the preferred ranged weapon for most cavalrymen. These tamba were carried in quivers of 10 to 20 at a time. Mandinka riders were extremely proficient at skirmishing with them. to the point that a 17th century European explorer compared their speed and punch to that of musket balls. For close quarters, riders would carry sabres, axes, clubs, and even hooks for dehorsing opponents. However, the most feared weapon was the lance. These were around 2 to 3 meters long, which could be used to spear opposing cavalrymen or ride down infantry. While some of this gear was traded for or imported, the Mandinka were well positioned to supply themselves. This was a result of their superior metallurgy and an early adoption of ironworking. Such practices yielded not only technological but also sociological developments. For instance, in their society, blacksmiths held important positions of influence. Thought to wield a spiritual power called Nyama, the result of their craftsmanship was zealously coveted by the ruling class. Blacksmithing was thus reserved to specific specialized families who held close ties with the nobility. From such a position, they were able to gain significant rights and privileges from the state. Crucially, this meant access to raw materials, timber fuel, and labor with which to power their industry. In exchange, these blacksmiths supplied the leaders with metal weapons and agricultural tools, allowing the Mandinka to field large, well-equipped armies with relative ease and speed. But the strength of the Mandinka army came not just from its equipment. Training was equally as important. Overall, we must understand that for a greater part of its history, the Mali Empire lacked a standing army. Forces were instead raised on an as-needed basis through conscription of free men from the general population. Thus, training was largely a personal, in-house affair. This was reinforced by the socio-cultural dynamics of the clan or extended family, which lay at the bedrock of many African societies. It was a matter of honor and social standing for men to distinguish themselves as warriors, and in particular to uphold their family name. This belief is exemplified by how Mandinka fighters took great pride in arming themselves. Bows, sabres, and lances were often passed down as family heirlooms. However, there were particular regions and families which were well known for their martial traditions. Places like Kabu in Senegambia, for instance, was famous for its warriors, attracting many young men to travel there to develop their combat skills. With respect to cavalrymen, such troops would have come from the upper echelons of society and thus already enjoyed higher levels of personal training. Equine training, in particular though, was the matter of specialists. Such skills were often found among veterans and clan elders, who could tutor aspiring knights. Other times, specialists would be imported from regions with a history of horsemanship. In terms of specific horse riding techniques, this came in many forms, which were readily mastered by the Mandinka. For instance, while novices learned simple mounting and dismounting, masters learned how to leap on and off their horses at a gallop. While novices learned the basic gaits, masters learned more sophisticated movements, like the ambling gait or various acrobatic leaps and airs. While novices led their steeds with reins, masters simply commanded them with whistles and were followed around by their horses like dogs. Combat-specific training was also emphasized. The Mandinka trained extensively to throw their javelins with great speed and precision against both mounted and foot targets. Here they are said to have been able to engage in lengthy single combat, skirmishing in graceful loops, while deftly picking up spent javelins from the ground to continue the fight uninterrupted. Close quarter skills were also learned, as were distinct methods of raiding. For instance, we hear that the Mandinka were even known to use their shields to erase horse footprints, thus concealing their tracks from enemies whilst on the move. All of this would have been reinforced in times of peace, by equestrian ceremonies and festivals. Here, knights would test their mettle in a variety of competitions, such as horse dancing, which is attested to in later centuries and which can still be seen in West Africa today. As for tactics, early Malian history reflects the use of heavy cavalry being placed in the center to batter enemy lines with frontal assaults, while archers and spearmen protected the flanks. Later reports, however, see this order of battle inverted, perhaps as anti-cavalry tactics were adopted. In such battles, archers, protected by spearmen in the center, would be used to skirmish with and soften the enemy center. Meanwhile, the cavalry would work the flanks of the enemy to strike them from the side or envelop them from the rear. With this understanding in mind, let us now discuss how such a force was organized for war. The Malian army fell under the overall control of the ruling Mansa. However, the field commander, be it the king or his subordinate, would bear the title of Mari, or prince. In the early days, it was to his banner which rallied the 16 clan leaders known as the Tontigi, or quiver masters. These high nobles were expected to personally lead units of cavalry, which were composed of lesser nobles and their retinue. These soldiers held the status of horon, or freeman. The size of such units likely varied, but may speculatively have been organized in a decimal fashion. Infantry forces, meanwhile, were led by officers known as kelekun, or warheads, who commanded units known as kelebolo, or war arms. Once more, their exact size is unknown, though each unit's strength was likely a reflection of the manpower of their home region. As for the size of an early Malian army, we may only speculate. Together, the 16 Tontigi may have mustered about 3,000 riders. Supporting them were the various native and allied infantry units, which are said to have far outnumbered the cavalry. If we assume about a 5 to 10 times multiplier, then we get a force of roughly 20,000 foot troops. Of these, some later sources reference a ratio of 3 archers to 1 spearman. Should this be the case, then we have a theoretical army of 3,000 cavalry, 15,000 archers, and 5,000 spearmen. Again, highly speculative in nature, but probably in the ballpark. Such was the force which the Mandinka Prince Sundiata may have led to confront the Soso king Sumunguru. Their clash is recorded in the ancient oral tradition of the Epic of Sundiata. No singular version exists, but we shall nonetheless do our best to reconstruct a narrative. Around 1235 AD, a vast invasion force of infantrymen descended upon the south to put down the upstart prince and his alliance. However, they seem to have been caught unprepared on open ground. Sundiata's heavy cavalry smashed them with a mighty charge, decimating those caught underfoot and sending the army fleeing. Enraged by this unexpected and humiliating defeat, King Sumunguru rode out to face the southern forces himself. Wary of the Mandinka cavalry, he chose a narrow valley as a battlefield. Here, he hoped to bait the vainglorious prince into a charge where he could then be surrounded. His tactic worked at first, as Sundiata set off with a predictable frontal attack. However, when Sumunguru's cavalry rode off to outflank the prince's forces, they fell into a counter-trap. Archers covering the flanks now unleashed a deadly rain of iron, fire, and poison-tipped arrows upon them. With the assault stalled and disorganized, Sundiata's cavalry rearguard found easy prey. These reserves swept down upon the Soso ranks, causing them to buckle and the entire army to retreat. Yet Sundiata chose not to chase after their fleeing enemy, perhaps to prevent his own forces from breaking formation and losing cohesion. The astute young leader waited some days before re-engaging the Soso encamped near present-day Bamako, where the fateful Battle of Karina would take place. Here, Sundiata's cavalry once more charged headlong against their Soso's counterparts, successfully pushing them back. Nonetheless, Sumunguru retaliated with his entire reserve forces, greatly outnumbering the Mandinka. The Soso counterattack brought them to the verge of capitulation. It all seemed to be leading to a crushing defeat for the Southerners. That is until legend tells that Sundiata himself sought out Sumunguru. The prince fought his way close enough to the enemy king to loose a clean arrow shot. It flew through the air, striking its target. The oral chronicle tells us that a wounded Sumunguru fled from the battlefield, never to be seen again. Upon witnessing this, his army broke, and with it, the Soso Empire. In the aftermath, Prince Sundiata would go on to claim it as his prize and found the Mali Empire. In our next episode, we shall explore how he and his successors built one of the greatest realms of its age. In particular, we shall seek to understand how its army evolved over the years and what great feats would be achieved by the glorious knights of this golden empire. For now, you can join us on Patreon or YouTube memberships to catch script previews and download our art. A big thanks to the current supporters and a shout out to the researchers, writers and artists for making this episode possible. We couldn't have done it without this team and this community. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like and subscribe for more content and check out these other related videos. See you in the next one.